Good evening and welcome to my Module 3 bonus assignment for PPCR. My name is Eugenie Suter and I'm located in Basel, Switzerland. For this assignment, I chose to review a meta-analysis, and I'll be taking you through 7 steps in looking at this analysis together. First, an introduction to the paper, then the study question, the search strategy used by the authors, how they selected their studies, the sensitivity analysis methods, and their assessment of publication bias. And finally, I'll have some conclusions for us at the end. The first of these topics, the introduction. The paper I chose is titled Facial Emotion Recognition in Major Depressive Disorder, and it's a meta-analysis. The authors are Fernando Kraus FC, Linardatos, David Fresco, and Michael Moore, and this was published in 2021. This meta-analysis looked at 23 studies with a total of 516 depressed participants and 614 euthymic control participants. And it looked at studies that examined facial emotion recognition, specifically ones that measured accuracy, and in subjects with major depressive disorder, or MDD. The background and motivation for this publication was that major depressive disorder has been associated with difficulties in social and interpersonal functioning, and deficits in emotional processing may contribute to the development and maintenance of interpersonal difficulties in major depressive disorder. Now, while some studies have found that MDD is associated with deficits in recognition of emotion and faces, other studies have failed to find any impairment. The above points are in fact direct quotes from the abstract of this paper, and I love the clarity of the 3-sentence structure. First the topic, then the impact, and then the unmet need. What was the study question? I used the PICO format to answer this. For the population, we were looking at depressed and dysthymic individuals in these studies. The intervention, there was none. These were observational studies. The control group were euthymic individuals, and the outcome they were looking at was the accuracy in facial emotional recognition achieved by these subjects. For timing, this was an acute study. The search strategy employed by the authors involved searching on PsycInfo and Medline tools, and they used the following keywords: emotion recognition, affect recognition, emotion processing, facial expression, facial affect, face, depression, and major depressive disorder. They looked only for publications published between 1986 and 2018. However, they also looked at studies that were cited in articles they had already identified. And in fact, in their search strategy, the authors included a method to address publication bias. So they directly solicited unpublished manuscripts using email inquiries to investigators who had published studies relevant to the topic. And of course, this isn't perfect because it only looks at a limited number of investigators. But I appreciated that they made an attempt to find unpublished information. How did they select the studies? Well, for the major depressive disorder population, they required a current diagnosis of MDD, and they required assessment of that either by clinical interview or semi-structured interview, or in fact by use of self-report measures. So not simply self-report, but measures that would ask the patient directly about symptoms and allow an assessment in that way. The control group had to have no prior history of any psychopathology. And the studies had to assess facial emotion processing and had to use processing accuracy, as in the percent of facial expressions that were correctly judged, as one of the outcomes. That objective criterion of accuracy had to be employed for at least one of the 6 basic emotions. So these are anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. They had to include statistical data that were adequate for the authors to then calculate Cohen's D. And the authors did make an attempt to contact the original paper authors to request additional information if that information was not provided in an otherwise adequate report. In addition, all studies had to be published in English, and of course, this doesn't introduce a bias of its own, quite possibly, in that much many authors might actually be excluded by this requirement. About the sensitivity analysis. Well, this was my biggest disappointment because there were actually no methods of sensitivity analysis reported in this paper. Because they were none reported, I went ahead and pulled up a tutorial on sensitivity analyses in clinical trials, which is listed at the bottom. The first author is Bain, and it was published in 2013. And sources that they could have addressed, sources of variability that could have been addressed through a sensitivity analysis that were not done in this paper include outliers, missing data, definitions of outcomes, clustering or correlation, baseline imbalances, as well as distributional assumptions. My sixth and final topic before the conclusions is publication bias. As we would expect, the authors used a funnel plot in order to evaluate this, and you can see that shown here on the right, so that you can get an impression of it. What the authors found was that the plot suggested the presence of some outliers with very strong effects, and you can see those here on the left of this graph. However, they also used two other methods. They used an FSN, or fail-safe N method, and they used a rank correlation test. And both of those tests, in fact, indicated no publication bias. So I found this a bit difficult to interpret because the different methods did find different results on publication bias. However, as we know, for publication bias, the best we can really do is to describe in the results using a funnel plot or other methods whether bias may have been introduced. And in addition, as I mentioned earlier, these authors did go to the effort of contacting authors of known papers to see if they had any unpublished results that they could share in addition to try to preempt any publication bias issues. We'll also share the results, which were that participants with major depressive disorder in inpatient settings or who had severe symptoms were less accurate in recognizing happy facial expressions of emotion when compared to participants who were in outpatient settings or mild symptoms of depression. And in addition, studies that presented the stimuli for longer durations actually found lower accuracy levels in those who were depressed relative to the controls. So some interesting findings here. However, and I'll skip over this forest plot, but just to give you an impression that most of the studies did fall on one side of the line as indicated in the results just prior. As I mentioned, there is a however here, and this pertains to my conclusions. So what were the positive points here? On the one hand, there's an interesting question: is accuracy even there in these studies? And in addition, the authors attempted to reduce the impact of publication bias and did assess that bias in the results. However, I found that the methods were problematic in other ways. For one, there was no sensitivity analysis reported, so it makes it really difficult to understand whether certain studies were influencing the results more than others. In addition, they included any of the 6 major emotional expressions, and they then averaged across these. And I found that that approach was not strongly defended in the paper. So I might have found this paper more valid had they looked at a more restricted question and looked at just one of the emotions. So overall, due to the methods issues, I find it unfortunately difficult to have confidence in either the internal or by extension the external validity of the findings in this review. I want to thank you for your attention and for the opportunity to present this meta-analysis using the methods we learned in the course.